All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I am your host, Dr. D. Today, we're going to talk about it's the community, stupid. Just like it's the economy, stupid, in elections, it's the community, stupid, in preparedness. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. And as always, a big shout out and thank you to everybody who continues to support the podcast Inside My Canoe Head by dropping over to our website, www.insidemycanoehead.ca, and for downloading it across all the platforms. We are on everywhere. We're in every system and we're in every app. So if you want to find us, you most definitely can. You can just simply go over to our Buzzsprout home. And we shout out to Buzzsprout for being an awesome hosting service. I've been with them since the beginning in April of 2020. Fantastic, great pricing, wonderful customer support, lots of great information to help us podcasters grow and understand the ecosystem in which we operate. So if you're ever thinking about starting a podcast, jump over to Buzzsprout, look at what they have. It's fantastic. So today we want to talk about it's the community, stupid. And that's not an insult to anybody out there, but it's the same type of frame as when we talk about politics. Who wins elections? It's about the economy, stupid. In the end, all of the things that seemingly get people fired up and excited and come out and march is not what makes people vote. People vote on kitchen table issues, dinner table issues, the things that make them turn and burn every day, their ability to live the lives that they want, to support their families in the way that they see necessary. It's all about the economy, stupid. And a lot of times ideological issues will pop up. Candidates will believe that that's the strategy that people are interested in, or there'll be some external event overseas or something. But when it comes down to it, Joe and Jane Q. Public, when they get up to vote, they're simply caring about their little kitchen table and their incredible family and what matters to them. So when we talk about preparedness, there's all kinds of people thinking about all kinds of things, but in the end, it's about the community. It's the community that wins the day. We always say, if you don't understand what we believe, look at what happens in the wild, right? The lone wolf perishes every time, but the pack thrives. Even when the pack is decimated by some type of exogenous shock, some event that comes in and punches it upside the head, the wolf pack recovers. We know that nature is symbiotic, which simply means that when you have a reduction, like when you have a reduction in food sources, when you have a reduction because of famine, because of droughts or something along that lines, wolves actually have less pups. It's that simple. They actually understand the environment, the biological understanding of the environment around them, and wolves will simply have less children when there's less food. When there's ample food, they'll have more children. And it's kind of this really cool relationship when you look at the literature on it. It's pretty fantastic. People need other people. We are a gregarious species. We're a tribal species. We thrive in groups and we barely survive on our own. Now, there are always going to be the lone wolf preppers, the folks that think they're going to give it a shot and run it alone. Listen, you're probably going to make it the first little bit, but you're eventually going to get sloppy. You're going to get tired. You're not going to be covered by somebody else. You're going to get sick. Life's going to happen to you and you're going to perish. It's not going to work out. Sorry, you may not believe what little old me says, and that's perfectly fine, but understand that the data supports survival of human communities through any set of exogenous shocks. So events that are beyond your control that happen and directly impact you. When you look at the literature through sociology, even some of the geography, anthropology, psychology, and you look, all of those disciplines are feeder disciplines into the emerging science, body of science in disaster and emergency management. When you look at the literature, it is one of the few cases where it's homogeneous. And that simply means that for the most part, over a certain percentage, the body of knowledge agrees with itself. And it's basically self-confirming, and it says that humans thrive in groups. Now, there's a traditional number called the 150 number, and I forget the guy, the individual who coined it. But the idea being is really before 1750. So we're only talking, a couple hundred years in the hundreds of thousands of years of the humanoid existence. Survival has been the key. It's been about our ability to make it through both the winter and the starving season, which those of you who've studied understand. That's the spring. So families would harvest what they could and store up what they could for the winter. They'd eat reasonably well in the winter, as little as they could as they survived the winter. But as they emerged in the spring and planting season started, nature needs about 70 days to start providing you some type of nourishment out of the ground. So the spring was always referred to as the starving season because that's when the food supplies were running very short from the previous winter, depending on if you had a really poor crop and a really poor harvesting season for animals, you were really strung out and, you were hoping that your children would live through the winter, but likely in your neighborhood, at least a couple of children would perish in the winter due to disease, cold, or something else. And people at Stark don't believe, and I learned this from an African study that was done in the 1980s at the height of the famine in Ethiopia and Eritrea. And it basically came out and said that if you wanted to have 3 children make it to the age of 18, you would have 5 babies. So now this is obviously skewed to the extreme because in rural Ethiopia they face far more. But the issue literally was if you wanted a set number of kids to survive, you needed to have more because you understood that, 20-30% of your kids would die before they got to the age of 18. You translate that in today's modern world and you look at your family, and that's just not something that we think about. And thankfully we don't. We've advanced society to do that. But the theory behind that is that humans would gather in tribes of about 150 people. And that was kind of like the ideal number of where with 150 people together, you would be able to support each other, right? So you weren't a self-sufficient unit as a household. The community was the self-sufficient unit. So you had people executing different skills, right? So if I was the carpenter, I was very good at building things. If I was the blacksmith, my son would become the blacksmith. And this would be handed down. It's just how the system worked. You would become a blacksmith if you were born the son of a blacksmith. If you were born a daughter, you would be married off. But if you were born the son, and the community of 150 would be self-sustaining, which meant that on their own, the family could not survive and make all the things and do all the things that it needed to do to be successful. It could if it was part of a community. So if we understand that, you have to look back and frame the modern day preparedness and survival conversation about the historical imperative that humans were tribal. We needed each other. We need each other to be successful. And there are very real physiological and neurological changes in a human when they operate in a group. And there's been some good, interesting studies about the difference. And some people, and not me, but some people, and I don't think they've really got the evidence nailed down yet, but some people are actually using that evidence right now to counter the narrative about the need to be to fight remote work, right? So people are saying that the studies and information has shown the benefits of humans when they're physically close together, the neurological and the physiological changes that happen in a human being and their growth and their intelligence and their creativity. And all of these things are increased when they're physically located with each other. People are using some of that research to counter the narrative that productivity is equal, lives are better quality, etc. I'm not convinced either way. I just haven't seen enough evidence to say that the benefits, which are noted, of being physically close together outweigh the personal benefits of remote work. It's just a really interesting debate. And it just gives you an idea of how a lot of this literature that exists in different fields can be used in different ways. And so if we understand the literature that and the research that points us towards community, we then have to look at community as the unit of measure. And I make this argument in an article that I wrote a couple of recent articles I wrote on Substack. I'm on Substack under Jeff Donaldson. It's free of charge. If you've never been on Substack, it's basically the place where all independent writers go to write their own material, to present arguments to you, to write stories, whatever it may be. There's a big push on Substack for people to put stuff behind a paywall. I don't do that. All of my stuff on Substack is free of charge. Right now, this morning, I checked. I have 84 subscribers. I lost one. Sorry to see you go, whoever you were. It's free of charge, right? I don't ask for money. I produce the material on there, and on top of this podcast that's recorded twice a week, and some YouTube videos that are starting up next week. We're going to try to put out 6 to 8 pieces of content, long-form content, every week to talk about the world of preparedness. Free of charge, always will be free to you. All the links are available on our 2 websites, www.insidemycanoehead.ca and over at our parent company, preparednesslabs.ca. Now, we do have a bunch of stuff behind a paywall, but that's a different conversation. That's not for here. Here at Inside My Canoe Head, we talk about preparedness, and if we want to get a prepared community, if we want to understand why communities or why individuals do better than others in the face of similar calamities, it really boils down to just that. It boils down to the community. So a bit of a flashback to this article that I wrote on the 2 days ago on the 12th. It's called "It's the Community. Economic Issues Wins Elections. Community Networks Win Preparedness." And just the opening paragraph here. Every discipline has a paradigm, a set of rules, norms, definitions, practices, and theories that frame the field. They inform new entrants and educates everyone along a well-structured roadmap. Whenever you enroll in a first-year chemistry course or any natural science, what you will learn is common wherever you are on the globe. The theory presents the mathematical methodologies employed, all mirroring each other, respecting the accepted standards within the paradigm. And that simply means that when you learn emergency management, when you formally study preparedness or recovery or response as part of an undergraduate or graduate education in university or college, you're going to learn the same theories, right? So it's considered a paradigm. Now, paradigm means that in general, everybody in the field has agreed that this is a norm, that, you know, a disaster is X, an emergency is X, preparedness means Y, etc. You know, because these things are exceptionally helpful to provide a common set of rules and processes that enable discovery. The theory comes from Thomas Khun's novel, if you've ever read it. It's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And really, if you want to understand science as a system, if you want to understand science as our way of discovery and our methodology for translating curiosity into helpful things, then it's really worth a read. Now, it's a long read. It's a scientific read, so it's not going to be something exciting like a Margaret Atwood book or something, but it really is a great reference if you're somebody who's interested in understanding science and why people use science, why we practice science, and why the scientific method is as good as it is, right? It's very important. And the reason I bring up Thomas Khun is when we think about preparedness is a well-structured subfield in the emerging discipline of emergency management, right? And there's a great writer, Patrick Van Horn, on Substack, and he has a newsletter called Left of Bang. And this subfield exists pre-event, right? So preparedness, whenever we talk about it, it's all the stuff that happens prior to the event occurring. Something addressable in times of peace and calm. FEMA literature calls this blue sky planning. So when you're thinking about getting ready for being able to navigate an event that is not certain will happen, but it may be likely to happen, FEMA returns that to blue sky planning. You know, however much of the information is written is about the moribund state of preparedness information, in that it remains grounded in the theories of the Cold War, published in some form using the norm, have a plan, be informed, make a kit, right? With the world significantly evolved past the 1980s global environment, we lack any evidence to support the continued use of that plan, of that message, the have a plan, be informed, make a kit. That is grounded in an era that no longer exists. You know, and this is where anomalies emerge. And when we study examinations of subpopulations post-event, we survey the populations and do research, we realize that something else comes out, and that's the community. And when we look at the role of community in preparedness, it's that those who have better post-event outcomes out of a population that all were faced with the same set of circumstances, the one variable that correlates clearly is the sense of community, the sense of belonging, and your sense of place, right? We're all part of a community, maybe different communities. Some communities are geolocated, like a physical neighborhood. Some communities are a faith group, which means they're not geolocated. They're just part of a dispersed group of people who believe in the common faith. And then you have different trades communities, right? Your professional communities that you may be a membership of. These are all communities in their right, and each one of them has great value. And when you have a sense of belonging to a community that is affected by a disaster, so most of the time we orientate to the first one, which is a neighborhood, because most disasters, not all, pandemic being an exception, most disasters have a geolocated or a geospatial aspect to them. And so when you look at people who are affected by a geolocation, so take a town, take a city. If you look at the city of, say, Fort Myers or someplace like that, and they get affected by a disaster, everybody gets the same set of effects, right? The storm goes through, and everybody has the same set of effects. They get hit by the same set of circumstances. And then what us researchers do is we look at the community and we examine those groups that emerge better, those groups that have better post-event outcomes, to understand why. We want to know the why this one group who had the same set of circumstances impact them came out better. And like I said, the one variable is the sense of community. And it often is expressed in the fact that we understand that, and let's preface these comments. Emergency management professionals are incredible people. I have many friends in the industry. I have 100% support for them. They're very well educated, they're reasonably resourced, and they're incredibly focused. Now, there are capacity and capability limitations to what they can do in a disaster. Unfortunately, we live in a society now where people have an outsized belief in what the government and its government agencies can do in times of disasters. So when a government agency does an absolute wonderful response operation, but it is far less than what the people want, they somehow view that as a failure, when in fact it was an exceptional success. The government did what they could. Now, a lot of the times they do what they could, but it's far less than the need in the area. That's just a capacity and capability limitation. The difference beyond that is taken over by the community. And so that's the preparedness gap that we talk about all the time. And when you have a strong sense of community, community jumps into that preparedness gap, and they fill all the needs, and immediate and longer term needs that aren't addressed by the limited capacity and capability that are rested within the government operations. And so strong communities do that. We know that people are pulled out of the rubble by the community, not first responders. We know that people are fed water and housed by the community, not the first responders, by a huge outsized percentage difference. We know that communities save each other. We know that communities bond. Now, when you look at the recovery side of things, we know strong vested communities are built back better because they're stronger advocates, right? Community centers are often the hubs. Community centers, church halls, etc., are often the hubs of communities. They're the sense of place. They're the common place where everybody goes to. If those are lost, those are actually built back faster and by the community. Now, when you look at different communities in recovery and those that are built back, strong sense of community has a greater return rate. And this was shown in Daniel Aldrich's work in that he did, and he looked at Hurricane Katrina. When you looked at the populations that came back, and you look at a measure of return rate, and that simply means what percentage of families returned to their disaster location to rebuild, and what percentage of the families left. Those with a strong sense of community, a sense of belonging, and a sense of place, they returned. Even though it might have been far easier just to relocate the family to a different place and restart, the groups and the communities that restarted faster and better were those that had a sense of place. They were back, they were cleaning up, they were getting the community center up and running, they were rebuilding their houses, they were setting up and running. And there's even great stories of communities when they were evacuated to FEMA trailers or relocated to different places. They put themselves in the trailers in the appropriate row and order that they were on the street. Right? So your neighbors in your FEMA trailer were the same neighbors in the same location as on the street. That only happens in strong sense of community. When you have that strong sense of community, it works. The reason why I do a lot of research in this is because we're always looking for the low-cost, high-value option that's out there, because we know that resources in emergency management are restrained. And with the new government that's coming into the United States of America and the new government that's going to come into the Canadian system in a year or so, you're going to see significant restraint in government spending. I don't care whether you like that idea or not. Actually, nobody cares whether we like it or not. But both those governments are going to do restrained funding in the social space, which means emergency management itself is likely not to see any exceptional inputs of money. So this gap that exists where the assistance required that's beyond the capability and capacity of your government agencies will have to be filled by community. And if we look at community and we look at the investment to outcome, it's incredible. We're looking at exponential multiples. When you look at investments that are made into community and community systems, the output far exceeds what you would get for a similar investment in the city. And what I mean by that is if I want to train search and rescue volunteers, first aid people, it is far cheaper and far more effective to do that in the community than try to hire and provide that through a public sector agency. And that's what I mean by exponential outgrowth. So when you look at the needs of a community after a disaster, when you look at the needs of the residents, building, etc., and you look at it from a perspective of skill sets and resources and organizations, you see that when you include the corporate private sector, because remember, businesses are residents of communities too. They have a very real issue if the community is not up and running. Because if the community is not up and running, people aren't shopping. If they're not making money, they go under. So they have a very capitalistic interest in having the community restored as fast as possible. But all of their employees and the business owners themselves, they're residents of the neighborhood. You have not-profit organizations, community organizations. If you've ever seen the Grandmother's Gardening Club or the Women's Cooking Club, a cooking organization out of the United Church, they are fantastically well organized and effective organizations that I would exceed probably most public sector agencies are able to provide. When you start looking inward to the community and you see these organizations that exist, you realize that most of what a community needs in the time of disaster is already resident in the community. It's just not organized and connected in a preparedness and response fashion. We've advocated here, and we've written before. I've written before on what I call a community response council or a community preparedness council. It's that idea of when we know our community is likely exposed to a hazard that's going to cause some type of calamity in the future, we look inward. We look at the community to see basic animalistic requirements of food, water, shelter, health, safety, and security, and that those needs can actually be met by existing capability within the community outside of any government assistance. So if we go back to that tribal reference I made at the beginning of the podcast, and you look at your community you live in, everything the community needs to be successful in navigating an event and emerging from an event exists in the community. It's already present. It's just not identified. You have engineers, you have nurses, you have everything that you need to be successful as a tight-knit community through a disaster already exists in the community. It's just not organized. And this is why myself and a couple of other external organizations are working very hard on putting together the training for this. And myself and the Institute for Social Capital out of Australia have been working on a course for emergency managers and business continuity professionals. We've been at this for about a year, putting the data and the information together. Now, that course is going to be launched hopefully 1 January, and it'll basically show the roadmap how to do that. How do we build a whole of society or a whole of community response or preparedness capability within our existing organization without expending substantial or any extra resources, maybe beyond a couple of plate of cookies. And I use the cookie reference because a very good friend of mine, Scott Cameron, uses it all the time when he does facilitation in his emergency social services company, BASA Solutions. He uses cookies, and nothing brings people together than cookies. If you get invited to a meeting, it's just another meeting, but we're going to have fresh baked cookies. Believe it or not, that actually is an influence in people's decision-making framework for whether they're going to go. But the point is that we are working very, very hard on putting together the roadmap and the step-by-step process as to how you do that. Now, a lot of community organizations do it by default. Most don't. And that means that while you have a strong sense of place, have you really looked at who has water pumps in the community? Who has generators? Who has first aid training or the ability to provide first aid training? Who has CERT training? Who would be interested in CERT training? Who has communications training? Who has information management training? You start looking inward to the community and you realize all of these things that are necessary to sustain a community through a calamity and out the other side and begin recovery already exist. Now, yes, you don't have bylaw officers. You don't have inspectors. You don't have insurance companies, etc. I get all of that. But the internal, everything that you need inside does exist, right? So as we build that out, as we build a community, you start to realize, hey, you know what? We're pretty well equipped. And I'll give you an example that happened. It's called the Student Army, and it was in the 2012 Christchurch earthquakes, 2011, 2012 Christchurch earthquakes that happened in New Zealand. Great literature, great stuff about it. Just Google it. And basically what it was is that this massive student army came out to assist. So they're called DRC, or Disaster Research Center, Type 4 emerging assistance groups that come out of a disaster. What it led to is some of the New Zealand agencies making or availing to communities kit and equipment. So the community had the strong sense of place. It has a strong sense of belonging. Everybody came out to help their neighbors, but they were grabbing whatever they had, which was shovels and the weirdest of things and implements that were not really necessary. If you look at what happened in Valencia, Spain, after some of the flooding, and you see you've got 10,000 people showed up from other parts of Spain and Italy, to just basically show up and move the mud with squeegees and everything else. So what the government did in New Zealand is realize we don't have a problem of the community helping the community. What seems to be missing in this piece is we lack the kit and equipment and training on the kit and equipment. So why not pre-position the necessary equipment in the community, put it in the community's hands, provide them the safe training for it, and the community will be the custodian. So imagine a shed in your neighbor's backyard, away from the home in case the home collapses and not near a tree that could fall on it. But inside that is your community level response kit. So you've got chainsaws in there, you've got fuel, you've got the safety equipment, you've got all kinds of things necessary to help open up the community that because all of that's going to be far beyond the city's ability to do for weeks, but it's all pre-positioned in the community, paid for through a taxpayer system, provided and maintained, and people are given training. So they realize that, hey, in my community, I'm missing a certain set of equipment. I have all the skills. I have people who know what to do. We're just missing a little bit. And then they advocate for it. And these groups and communities have these pre-positioned kits. There used to be yellow sea containers. And I forget the company now that did it. But they were basically 50-person emergency shelters in a yellow sea container that could be pre-positioned next to your community center. And it basically had external tenting, it had the cots, it has the blankets, it had the water purification systems, it had the washroom systems. It had all the basic necessities for setting up an emergency shelter, was pre-positioned in the community. They fundraised and raised the money for it. Big, bright yellow thing that was next to schools or somewhere that had open ground that they could build it upon. The community itself was trained on it. So when there was a disaster in that area, it would be the community that would go out, open it up, the community would set up, and the community would operate the emergency shelter. It wouldn't be a government agency. It wouldn't be government employees. It would be the community facilitating itself and rescuing itself, right? So what that would mean, if you translate that forward, you live in a community, right? Where are you going to get sources of information? Where's the community going to congregate? Where are you going to check on your neighbor? Like, where is the center of the community and the source of information? And where can you go get a hot cup of coffee, right? Generally, they get announced. In most emergencies, the government has set up an emergency relief center at such and such a place. Go there for free coffee, charge your cell phones, and get some information. That kind of thing comes out. But what if that was pre-planned? What if that was pre-existing in your community? You and your community had got together and said, hey, I live in a community of a couple of thousand people or a couple of hundred people. We want to have a pre-existing place. So we've got an open piece of ground that will always be available to us. We're going to set this up. So now you don't need anybody to tell you where to congregate. You don't need anybody to inform you what's happening next. As a community, you know your role. When an emergency happens, you know that this system is going to be set up. You know there's going to be a place to get good, accurate information, to see other people, back to that gregarious being in the physical space of other people and the neurological and physiological benefits that come from being physically located to another human. You know all of this is going to exist, right? And you know where it is. You don't need government operations. You don't need announcements. You don't need crisis communications. You don't need somebody to come in and to do this for you because the community is going to do it itself. These are things that are possible when we understand the value of community and emergency management, when we understand that our professionals and our first responders are brilliant individuals, but there is a very real limitation, their capability and capacity to what they can do, to what they can achieve. And it's not because of lack of effort, lack of skill, lack of tenacity, or lack of commitment. It's that there is a line that after which, no matter what is happening, nobody can help you. That's the you're on your own argument, right? When we say you're on your own, we don't mean you as an individual. We mean your community is on its own. So if you want something good to happen, if you want to build a resilient, robust community, you do it in the community. You don't do it through more government money or anything ridiculous like that. You get together, you identify the needs, and you fundraise, right? And I say fundraising because people will just say, we need a government program for that. I don't know about you, but I don't know when this end of government programs happens because I don't know where they get all the money from. Actually, I do. I see my pension check and everything that's taken off of it. But the point is, communities fundraise themselves. And I'll use a prime example. The one most effective community support organization or system right now that exists is food banks. Because food banks are funded by the people, and they're run by the people for the people. They're not run by government grants for the most part. They're not run by private enterprise. They're run by a board of governors who set up the system and support it and create the networking and the outreach so that the community does it. So the community will raise the money to create a resilient community. You don't need somebody else to give you money. You don't need the magical government checks to drop into the bank accounts. This may be you may view this as an ideological thing, but what I'm saying it for is because it's often used as a barrier. People talk about the economic barriers to preparedness. It happens all the time. It doesn't exist. Preparedness is free, and there are no economic barriers. And I've argued this exceptionally hard for a very long period of time, right? And I'll give you an example. When I was living in southern New Brunswick in my Army career, I lived in a small community that had a very strong religious faith base. The average salary of non-military members there was probably about $25,000 a year for the families. And they raised in a short period of time $150,000 to build a new church. So don't tell me your community does not have the funding to do the things necessary to prepare your community to be resilient, right? That's a non-starter. You have choices, you have opportunities, you have building resilience over time. There are many methodologies to it. The reason I keep hammering away on that is because, again, I'll go back. How many times when I've spoken to communities or I've spoken to influential, socially connected individuals within communities, and they say, well, there's no government funding. We don't have any funding for this. And I'm somewhat ideologically tired of organizations and people saying, I would do that, but I don't have funding. If you're going to sit around and wait for the government magic money to show up, then you're probably not going to achieve much in life. I mean, that's just basically the way it is. You can build a resilient community without any investment from the government. If your government has preparedness grants, if your government has other things, then get after it, go after it. But most of the success that I have seen, not all, absolutely not. This is not a homogeneous body of work, but most of the success that I have seen in my over a decade in this preparedness space has been by communities taking ownership, funding it 100% through their own fundraising efforts. I'll tell you this. I'll give you an example here in Ottawa before we jump on to the last point and then close it out for the day. We have something called the Snowsuit Fund, right? There are unfortunate kids in our society who don't have enough cold weather gear, and kids grow. If you've ever had children, you know the frustration, the joy of them growing, but the frustration of them growing out of all of their cold weather gear. And we live in the world's most northern capital here. It gets freaking cold. Everybody needs a snowsuit. So every year we have the Snowsuit Fund, right? So do people donate? Yeah, but guess what we run? And when I mean we, I mean a local radio station, not myself. They run a 50-50 contest. That means you buy tickets, 50% of the money goes to the winner, 50% buys snowsuits. We raise almost $1 million for that every year. $500,000 goes towards buying new snowsuits. Not a damn bit of government money necessary. No municipal program. No taxpayers' input whatsoever. The community rallies around, and 50-50s are just an awesome way to go because people see something in it for them. Yes, they're helping out their community, and they've got an opportunity to get a windfall money. One person wins $500,000 every year. And every year, $500,000 worth of snowsuits are bought and provided free of charge to the needy in our system. Absolutely wonderful. Doesn't require the government. We somehow have to move the conversation away from requiring government programming to be successful at anything, right? Emergency management is incredible. They do their jobs exceptionally well. They're very well trained, but they have real limitations. They can't provide you free of charge first aid training, CERT training, or all these other things. They just don't have the capacity to do it. But the community most certainly has the capacity And if it chooses to do so, it most certainly can deliver that for its residents. And that is how you build resilience. You build resilience by building a strong community, by building a group of people who have a common sense of place, right? Because as we know, we get shocked, exogenous shocks, events happen beyond our control, right? So they come in and they impact us from 5 different sources. We have political, economic, familial, cultural, and natural sources. So something could happen in the natural world like an earthquake. Something can happen in familial, like you could have a death in the family. You could have something cultural, like you could have a cultural clash within your community, within different religions. You could have economic strife, as happened in the pandemic, or a downturn, or the 1973 oil crisis, if you're old enough to remember that. And then political, folks. We just had a pretty consequential decision by a foreign nation. I say foreign because I'm Canadian. And the electorate of the United States of America chose their next leader. They have the right to do that, and it does impact the world. And it didn't matter which way that election went. It would have significant impact on world operations and how a lot of other countries conduct themselves, and especially here in Canada, because we often say, as a good Canadian northern neighbor to the United States, we're a mouse in bed with an elephant, and we pray every night that it doesn't roll over. The point is that we are very much dependent on the United States of America for our economic prosperity. We move somewhat in tandem with the U.S. economy, but not always. And our leadership's most important role, and this has been traditional in Canadian politics for 100 years, our most important relationship to manage is that with whomever is in the White House. So none of it is about whether you agree with the person in the White House. Everything is about, as a Canadian, is we need a strong and robust and close relationship. We need a community with our friends to the south. Now, that political environment is going to change. And again, I don't care whether you think it's good or bad. It's about something that I wrote on LinkedIn yesterday, and it got some pretty good feedback, was the world is, you're getting an exogenous shock. The world is changing. Leadership is, and focus is being reorientated. And again, it's back to if your party didn't win that election, you've by now had your time to have your pity party and your crying party and your I can't believe this happened party. Now you're in your grown-up phase where you have to realize that this is the world I'm going to live in for the next 4 years. It doesn't matter whether I like it. It doesn't matter whether I agree with it. This is the world and environment in which I operate. What means is you have to learn how to navigate that successfully. You have to learn what are the opportunities that are going to emerge from this change in governance, from this political shock, and then how do I take advantage of those opportunities? How do I grow my personal wealth, grow my personal fortunes, and increase my preparedness by understanding the environment I'm in and adapting to it, right? Communities do that as well, not just individuals. So your community, wherever you may be, has to understand the changing landscape. And what I mean by that is not just the head. The head is just a talking beast, whatever. I don't care. It's the programmatic changes that may come to systems that you rely upon, right? So, for example, I live in a government town, right? Imagine if you were in Washington, D.C., or you were in Virginia, and you have 2 individuals, Vivek and Elon, come along, been put in part of an organization, and Vivek has been very open that he is going to reduce the employees of the U.S. federal government by 50% in 1 year. Now, for a lot of people not living in Virginia, they're probably high-fiving each other because that's a huge amount of government savings, right? Their communities are like, this is good. The government's going to cost less, which is a good day. They'll need fewer tax dollars. Context matters. If you're sitting in Virginia and your entire community is comprised of people who work for the federal government, and 50% are about to lose their jobs, and the 2 gentlemen would like to take it to 75% of the U.S. government employees being fired by the end of year 2, You have an exogenous shock coming your way. Now your community has to sit back and figure out, we can't control this. We can't stop this. So what are we going to do as a community to navigate the shock? That's a very real political shock that is then going to have very real economic shocks on individuals, families, and the community. This is the point of understanding the role of community in preparedness. It's not just about wildfires or floods. It's about a strong sense of community serves your community for every possible existential threat that may be out there. So hopefully today's little conversation about communities, the role of communities, and why communities are the key secret sauce and the appropriate unit of measure in emergency management. Hopefully it was helpful to you. Thank you very much for all of those who continue to provide feedback at Inside My Canoe Head. My personal email is there. I answer them. The team here understands that I answer all of those emails myself. Nobody else gets to do that. Make sure you send them in, good, bad, or indifferent. Subscribe if you love it. We'd love to have you here. Remember, the writing that I do on Substack, the videos I produce on our YouTube channel, which is called Preparedness Labs, and the podcast here will always be free. There never will be a paywall for those things. There will be free, time immemorial. It's our gift to the community to continue to provide evidence-based, non-apocalyptic preparedness education for rational people. If you're interested in that, subscribe across the platforms, follow us. We got great information. We look forward to the coming season of the holidays. Merry Christmas in advance to everybody. This is going to be a great season. We look forward to it. Stay tuned, take care, and stay safe.